Today we'll be talking about probabilistic planning as a broader overview before we get to the model itself. And the key concept behind probabilistic planning is that it's quite different from the typical linear forecast. One of the core questions is why shift from what has been done for years to an approach that's more probabilistic and takes into account uncertainty. The biggest issue is that the uncertainty in what loads will be going forward has been increasing, substantially. There's bigger penetration of solar. There's issues in terms of whether loads will be declining or increasing. So you have to factor in that uncertainty in looking at planning decisions. A linear forecast essentially assumes that you have precise knowledge. You know when you'll need to build something, and you know what the load growth will be going out. Now, in practice, no one knows precisely when loads will exceed ratings or by how much, or when that infrastructure investment will be triggered, which is why most planning departments actually reprioritize their list of projects annually, to be able to identify, adjust for errors in the forecasting. Now, a probabilistic approach takes a different tack on this because it essentially acknowledges that the forecast, number one, is not necessarily a linear pattern in terms of the growth. And second, it factors in a substantial amount of uncertainty. So to illustrate this, let's take a look at the panel that we have here on the left-hand side. And one side we kind of show here's a linear growth, what is the traditional approach. But in practice, you can have a path that grows at a faster rate than anticipated, and it builds on top of each other. It doesn't always grow the same amount each year, but it builds on top of each other, and you would have to trigger an upgrade much sooner because of that. Conversely, you can have a situation where the low growth with the same starting point is just slower than initially anticipated. A pretty prominent example of that would be the forecasting right before the financial crisis of 2008. Probably all those forecasts are incorrect if you looked at the linear forecast. And obviously in this second situation, you wouldn't even need to upgrade at all. So this is illustrated primarily by this fan type of graph, where the further you go out in time, the less you know. It's much easier to forecast 1 year out than it is to forecast 5 years out, even 10 years out. And that's the primary challenge you face in most planning decisions, is how do you incorporate that uncertainty, how do you ground the decision making, and take into account risk. There are several factors that are going to affect the value and timing of infrastructure upgrades. The most key ones are essentially what is the room left for growth. And by that we mean typically you size substations or transformers, etc., to have room for growth and to accommodate additional load growth. The second factor is the growth rate. If you grow really fast, then you're going to start hitting your capacity limits pretty quickly. The third factor that we look at is uncertainty in the growth rate and the uncertainty in the weather. And the weather side, if you have a very extreme weather year versus a cooler weather year, the chances that you're going to start exceeding the design rate are higher. The fourth factor is the magnitude, timing, and cost of the team in the investments. And the fifth one is really the shape of the loads, really when, how often, and for how long you're going to exceed design ratings. And that has to do a lot with the load duration curve and actually the hourly load shape itself. So the concept number one, the room left for growth, is pretty intuitive. We essentially have a couple of different potential ratings where you trigger an investment. In practice, the distribution and transmission constraints are not hard. You can exceed them for a period of time. But typically, when you exceed a design rating, you're exposing yourself to risk, because if a different, a component in the system goes down, then you're not going to have the ability to recover. You're going to start experiencing outages. But contrary to popular belief, it's not the thermal limit that is most often the constraining factor. It's really a design issue in terms of the ability to ensure that you're going to minimize the risk of a collapse. the more room you have, the further out into the future you're likely to have that upgrade. So it affects really the timing quite substantially. The second a key component to the doing well for growth is really taking a look at the load duration curve. And for those who are not quite as familiar with the load duration curve, what a load duration curve does, it stacks, data, historical data, for the highest peak hour first, the second, the third, and so forth. And you can do this when you're looking at historical data, or you can do it looking at 8760 hourly data, annual hourly data for forecasted years. So here's an example of one, and in this case, we actually showed it as a percentage of hours in the x-axis. And there's a couple of things that jump out. We have two sets of rating. One is the long-term emergency rating, or the design rating. And then we have a short-term emergency rating. And the long-term emergency rating, the short-term emergency rating only applies to transmission, and there you don't want to hit that rating at all. So we're looking at comparing that to the annual peak. The short-term emergency rating, the long-term emergency rating, sorry, the orange line, is actually the more relevant one for distribution and also relevant for transmission, where you essentially allow a certain amount of risk. You're going to allow loads to exceed that rating up to a certain share of hours. And in this case, the value that's typically used might be 6% or 8% for distribution. But you're really looking at, which year do you cross that threshold at the 6% value, or whatever the amount of allowable risk is. Concept number 2 is location-specific growth rates. Historically, the growth rates have not been estimated for a specific location. They've been estimated for general broader areas or for utilities as a whole. So this is actually one of the most dramatic shifts. It's actually trying to quantify, here's the growth rate at this specific location. And a key element of that is the data cleaning. What this chart plots is essentially two key components side by side. One of them is the growth rate for individual substations. This is coming out of the most recent initial DSO filing, and you can see that it estimates a growth rate for individual locations. Some of them have higher growth rates, some of them have declining growth, as is expected. And then we look at the loading factor. And the loading factor is simply, here is the annual load, or the annual peak in the case, divided by the design rating. So the closer you're to 100%, the higher the loading, and the more likely you're going to be facing an upgrade. And the faster the growth rate, the more likely you're going to be needing an upgrade as well. Obviously, you can have situations where loads are declining and you have high loading factors, in which case the wait-and-see approach might be prudent. But the ones you really have to be concerned about are situations where you have high loading factors and have high growth rates overall. The third concept is the valuation. And valuation is typically looked at by comparing, here is the cost of a T&D upgrade, annualized, in terms of how it goes into the rate base. And here it is without the load growth. So you can compare them side by side. In some cases, what we're often doing is actually comparing and saying what happens if we manage the load growth by something such as distributed energy resources, which can include batteries, energy efficiency, demand response, etc. And you look at this and you calculate it with and without the additional load, and the savings is really the difference in the time value of money between those investments. Fourth concept is that load shifts matter. They can vary by location. This graph is showing actual Central Hudson substation loads. And we essentially took an algorithm and classified them based on load shift. And to do this, we had to normalize the shapes. So each of these is actually the top 5 days of and we took the average across them. And we essentially converted them so there under each curve adds up to 100%. So each location saying, here's the share of your load that's occurring hour 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And then we kind of grouped them into natural pairing. And the load shifts vary a bit. They don't vary too much, but you still have to pay attention to it because it determines how often you're likely to exceed different thresholds that you have at those locations and when that happens. Obviously, something with a load shape number 6 is going to have a very, very different pattern than something that's an evening peaking location such as load shape number 2, or something that peaks slightly earlier in the day, like load shape number 3. Concept number 5 is quite simple. Uncertainty matters. No one knows precisely what in advance what the path the growth will take. And this is an example where we're simulating some of those growth trajectories. We only included 50 of them. We typically do about 5,000 or 10,000 of them. But it's useful to understand what's happening in the background. And what's really occurring here is that we can look at one line. For example, take a look at this blue line right here. And from our starting point, we have a path. It builds on top of each other. You know, the growth in the first year builds on top of the growth on the prior year, and the growth in the second year builds on top of the growth of the first year. You have this path which is not truly random, both because it's stacking up on top of each other, but because the actual growth is related to each other. You know, if you have a booming economy and a growing location in this quarter, chances are you're going to have a growing economy and growing population in the next quarter with a random component added in. So you can see the pathway that you have, but each of these represents a potential growth trajectory. And what we do here is we assess when that investment would be if the investment will be triggered for each of these paths, when that investment will be triggered for each of the paths, the magnitude, the deferral potential for each of those, given those paths, and really the value of that deferral potential. Now, typically this is expressed on bands, but really we have results for each individual pathway. The other component of uncertainty here is not just growth itself. It's actually looking at the uncertainty in weather. So you have uncertainty in terms of some of the growth, but a big driver is really not knowing whether or not the next year or 5 years down the road will be an extreme year or a relatively normal year or a cooler year. So what this chart shows is the load for a particular location, and it looks at what current loads would look like plugging in weather for different years. And in this case, it's showing what the peak load would be if we had experienced in this year the weather that was experienced in, say, 2001. And what it illustrates is the band and the influence of weather on what the loads may look like. So at the lower end, the numbers can range in this case by as much as 25% from the extreme to the normal, depending on what type of weather year you have. And the key component here is combining the uncertainty of the two, the uncertainty in the growth as well as the uncertainty in what the weather will look like and how that influences loads and planning decisions. There are several steps that we're going to walk through in the model itself, which range from cleaning the data, which is most likely the most critical component, since if you put in bad data, there's a good chance you're going to be mixing up bad data with growth or load declines. So that's actually one of the more core aspects of the model that we share with you guys. Then we look at estimating historical growth rates and growth drivers, so you can get an estimate of here's the local growth and the variability in that growth. And we then simulate the potential growth paths, including, and ideally we'll look at also pathways for solar penetration, energy efficiency, other things that are uncertain that are going to affect the loads overall. And then we look at estimating the deferral potential and the T&D marginal cost with and without load growth for each scenario and location. So those are really the key steps. And as part of this outcome, we're going to see a lot of output, but some of the key ones are the likelihood of and cost of T&D upgrades, right? So you can identify here's the likelihood that we'll exceed the risk tolerance by 2020. Here's the likelihood we'll exceed the short-term emergency rating by 2020, or whichever year you want to look at. And for each run and for each year, because we're running these simulations, we produce an estimate of avoided costs that factors in the probability of an upgrade. So quite simply, in most cases, we're going to report the expected value. And in this case, expected value is roughly $62 per kVA a year. But in practice, this is actually a mix of a number of simulations or scenarios where we ended up with a conclusion that no upgrade was needed, roughly about 35% of them, and scenarios where you kind of said, well, different amounts of load change would have led to avoiding the upgrade depending on the scenario. And that's why you have this distribution of value per kVA overall as a whole. But we'll cover this in more detail as we start working through the model itself. So with this, we'll shift over and give you guys a look at the model overview, and then kind of dive deep into each of the different steps in working through that model.